Ranger Sarah Mitchell received an emergency call at 4:47 p.m. on a May afternoon as the shadows of the Grand Canyon began to lengthen and temperatures finally started to drop from their terrifyingly high levels. A group of 6 hikers, despite carrying satellite phones and emergency signal devices, had not returned from the Bright Angel Trail. 12 hours late, and with no communication established. Central, this is Mitchell. I'm mobilizing the search and rescue team for the overdue group. Their last known location was Indian Garden at 10 a.m. this morning. Copy that, Sarah, replied Linda Chen from the communications center. But there's something odd. The emergency beacons are still transmitting. All 6 are sending active signals from the same coordinates, but those coordinates don't correspond to any trail or accessible terrain. Mitchell checked her GPS unit, finding the beacon cluster positioned deep in a canyon branch, marked as impassable on all official maps. The area was a geological dead end, sheer walls, no water sources, no reason for experienced hikers to attempt entry. I'm heading down with Tom. Alert helicopter support for possible technical rescue. Ranger Tom Reeves met her at the trailhead, both carrying climbing gear for whatever impossibility they'd find. The descent into Grand Canyon at this hour meant racing against darkness, but 6 missing hikers overrode safety protocols. They hiked fast, reaching Indian Garden at 6:23 p.m. The camping area was empty, no sign the group had stopped here as planned. But at the northern edge, they found something that violated basic navigation logic. Fresh footprints, 6 distinct sets, led directly toward a canyon wall. Not around it, not past it, but into it, as if the hikers had walked through solid rock. This doesn't make sense, Reeves said, examining the tracks. These prints are fresh, maybe hours old. They lead straight to the wall and stop. No return prints, no indication they turned around. Mitchell approached the rock face, finding it completely solid. She pressed against it, checked for hidden passages, looked for any explanation. Nothing. Just ancient limestone that had stood here for millions of years. That's when they heard the voices. Faint, distant, echoing from somewhere impossible. 6 different voices, calling for help, screaming in panic. But the sound wasn't coming from any direction that made acoustic sense. It seemed to originate from inside the canyon wall itself. "Hello?" Mitchell called. "Can anyone hear me?" "This is Park Ranger Sarah Mitchell." The voices responded, but distorted, stretched, like audio playing at wrong speed. "Help us! Trapped! Can't find way out! Darkness everywhere!" Reeves activated his radio. "Dispatch, we have audio contact with missing hikers, but cannot determine location. Voices are coming from solid rock wall at coordinates 36.0847 degrees north, 112.1455 degrees west." "That's impossible," Chen replied. "Those coordinates place you at a geological barrier." "There's no cave system, no passages, nothing hollow in that formation." But the voices continued, and now Mitchell could distinguish individuals. Emily Parker, one of the missing hikers, her voice breaking with terror. "We can see light, but we can't reach it. Everything is wrong here. The walls keep moving." Mitchell pressed her ear against the rock, hearing the voices more clearly through the stone than through open air. They were inside the formation somehow, trapped in geology that shouldn't be hollow. Dr. James Holland arrived by helicopter at 7:51 p.m., bringing ground-penetrating radar and acoustic analysis equipment. He'd studied Grand Canyon's unusual properties for a decade. Magnetic anomalies, sound distortions, places where normal physics seemed optional. "This is Echo Canyon's influence," Holland explained after running scans. "The acoustics here are impossible. Sound waves behave non-linearly, creating what we call acoustic lensing. Voices can transmit through solid rock, refract around corners, even travel backward in time by milliseconds." "Can you locate them?" "I'm trying, but the radar is showing contradictions." "There's definitely hollow space beyond this wall, but it shouldn't exist according to geological surveys. It's like a pocket dimension, space that isn't supposed to be there." They drilled test holes, finding the rock solid for 30 feet before suddenly opening into void. Air flowed from the holes, carrying the hikers' voices more clearly. "We're here." Emily Parker's voice emerged from the drill hole. "We can hear you drilling." "We're trying to reach the sound, but the passages keep changing," Mitchell shouted into the hole. "Stay where you are. Do not move. We're coming to get you." "We can't stay still. The walls are shifting. This place is alive." Holland analyzed the acoustic properties, discovering terrifying truth. "The rock formation is creating temporal sound loops." Their voices are reaching us, but time-delayed and spatially distorted. When Emily says, "We're here," she might be 50 feet away, or 500, or the sound might have taken hours to reach us, even though it left her mouth seconds ago. They brought in drilling equipment, boring through the formation toward where radar suggested hollow space existed. At 11 feet depth, the drill broke through into cavity, and a rush of air carried out more voices. But now they heard dozens, not just 6. Voices from different decades. Someone crying for help in language that sounded like 1950s American English. Another voice with old-fashioned phrasing, possibly from the 1980s. And underneath it all, older sounds, possibly Native American languages, Spanish from centuries past. "This isn't just the current missing group," Holland said, his voice shaking. "This hollow space has been collecting lost hikers for decades, maybe centuries. They're all trapped in there, their voices preserved and looped by the acoustic anomaly." Mitchell made the decision to enter. They widened the drill hole, creating an opening large enough for a person. She volunteered to go first, rappelling into darkness with a headlamp, rope, and communication gear. The large, cathedral-like cavity had petroglyphic walls that predated the known presence of Native Americans, as though existing in dimensions that defied standard three-dimensional rules. The space was too big to fit inside the formation they had drilled through, defying the external geology. "Can you hear me, Sarah?" Through the hole, Reeves called. "Hardly." "The radio is not very strong. However, I can hear the hikers. They are near." She followed the voices through passageways that twisted in ways that were impossible to follow, tunnels that looped back on themselves while still moving forward, chambers where the ceiling was somehow below the floor, and corridors that felt like they led downward but actually led upward. Then she located them. All 6 hikers, huddled in a chamber, alive but disoriented. Emily Parker looked up as Mitchell's light swept over them, her face showing profound relief mixed with confusion. "Ranger?" "Oh, thank God. We've been trapped here for days. How long has it been?" 12 hours since you were reported missing." "That's not possible. We've been here for at least 3 days. We ran out of water yesterday. David's watch shows 72 hours since we entered this place." Mitchell checked David Parker's watch. It indeed showed 3 days had passed. But topside, only 12 hours had elapsed since the group's last check-in. "We need to leave now. Follow me exactly. Don't deviate from my path." Leading them back proved nightmarish. The passages she'd used to enter had changed. Walls shifted, tunnels redirected. The space was reconfiguring itself, making navigation impossible by conventional means. "Use the voices," Holland coached through crackling radio. The acoustic lensing works both ways. Follow the sound of my voice back to the entrance. They navigated by audio, following Holland's continuous transmission through passages that made no geometric sense. At one point, they walked through a corridor where Mitchell could touch both walls simultaneously despite them being visibly 30 feet apart. In another chamber, gravity felt optional, their steps requiring conscious effort to stay grounded. After what subjectively felt like hours, but registered as minutes on Mitchell's watch, they found the drill hole. One by one, the hikers ascended, pulled up by Reeves and the rescue team. When all 6 were topside, Emily Parker broke down, pointing at her watch. "We were there for 3 days. I remember every hour, going hungry, rationing water, sleeping twice. How can it have been only 12 hours? Dr. Holland examined all 6 hikers, finding physiological evidence supporting their claims. Dehydration levels consistent with 3 days without water. Muscle fatigue, suggesting prolonged stress. Circadian rhythm disruption, indicating multiple sleep-wake cycles. Time flows differently in there, Holland explained. The cavity exists in spatially and temporally distorted dimensions. You experienced 72 subjective hours, while 12 objective hours passed outside. Your body's aged 3 days, while the world aged half a day. Mitchell reviewed her own bodily state, feeling exhaustion that matched hours of exertion, not the subjective minutes her watch indicated. The cavity had affected her too. Time stretching and compressing based on something other than normal physical laws. They sealed the drill hole, marking the area as hazardous. But monitoring equipment picked up continued transmissions from inside. Voices of hikers who'd entered the cavity in previous decades, still trapped, still calling for rescue in an acoustic loop that preserved their distress signals indefinitely. Agent Marcus Webb arrived from a federal agency that specialized in temporal and spatial anomalies, and Grand Canyon contains 17 documented locations where space and time behave abnormally. This cavity is the most severe. Actual geometric distortion creating pockets that exist outside normal dimensional constraints. Can we rescue the others? The voices from past decades? Unknown. If they're still physically alive in there, they'd be elderly or dead by now from our perspective. But inside the cavity, time dilation might have preserved them, or they might be acoustic echoes only, consciousness patterns recorded in the rock, playing eternally without the actual person remaining. Mitchell thought about the implications. Dozens of hikers lost over decades, trapped in geometry that defied mapping, experiencing subjective years while hours passed outside, their voices preserved in acoustic loops that transmitted through solid stone. We need better warnings. Hikers don't know about these danger zones. Official policy is to not publicize temporal anomalies. It would cause panic, liability issues. Missing hikers are attributed to conventional causes: falls, exposure, getting lost. The truth would be impossible to explain in court. But Mitchell knew the voices would continue. Every rescue team that approached the sealed cavity would hear them. Cries for help from different eras, preserved in acoustic loops, transmitted through rock that shouldn't be hollow. Evidence of hikers trapped in dimensional pockets where time and space operated by rules that violated everything physics claimed was possible. The voices from nowhere. Because they came from somewhere that existed outside conventional geometry, from hikers who walked into cavities that bent dimensions around them, trapping them in time-dilated spaces where 3 days could pass while the world outside counted hours, where walls shifted and passages reconfigured, where sound traveled through solid matter and gravity became optional, where rescue was nearly impossible because finding the entrance again required navigation techniques that assumed reality obeyed logical rules it clearly didn't in these pockets of Grand Canyon's impossible geology. 3 weeks after the Parker Group rescue, Mitchell returned to the sealed cavity entrance with specialized monitoring equipment. The voices had intensified, no longer just faint echoes, but clear, desperate transmissions from hikers trapped across different time periods. "Sarah, you shouldn't be here alone," Tom Reeves radioed from base camp. "That area is classified as unsafe." "I know, but I keep hearing a specific voice. A woman named Jessica Morgan. She's been calling for help for what she says is 5 days, but our records show no one by that name is currently missing." Mitchell ran the name through park databases, finding a disturbing match. Jessica Morgan, age 23, had disappeared from South Kaibab Trail in 1987, 36 years ago. The case was never solved. Her body never recovered. "That's impossible," Reeves said when Mitchell shared the finding. "She'd be 59 now if she survived." "The voice you're hearing sounds young. Because inside the cavity, time is frozen or severely dilated. If Jessica entered in 1987 and got trapped in a high dilation zone, she might have experienced only days while decades passed outside. She could still be 23, subjectively 5 days into her disappearance, calling for rescue right now." Dr. Holland affirmed the viability of the theory. 36 years outside would feel like 1,314 days inside, or about 3.5 years if she were to enter a pocket where time moves at 1/10 of its usual speed. She would have only experienced 131 days if time dilation were even more severe, say 100th speed. She is still waiting for a rescue that seems just a little bit overdue. Mitchell's choice went against all safety procedures. "I'm returning inside, this time with the right gear and a lifeline to keep you from getting lost." Agent Webb attempted to stop her. "Everyone caught in temporal pockets cannot be rescued. Some have spent centuries there. Even if their voices continue, their physical bodies might no longer exist. But Jessica Morgan might still be alive. Actually, alive, not just an echo. I have to try." She entered through the drill hole at dawn, rappelling into the cavity with 500 feet of rope secured topside, radio equipment, 3 days of supplies, and tracking devices that would theoretically maintain connection despite spatial distortion. The cavity had changed since her first entry. Passages ran in different directions. Chambers had shifted position. New petroglyphs covered walls that had been blank before. The space was actively reconfiguring itself, proving Holland's theory that the geometry wasn't static, but fluid. "Jessica," Mitchell called into the darkness. "Jessica Morgan? Can you hear me?" "Yes. Oh God, yes. I'm here. I've been here for 5 days. Please help me." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, acoustic lensing making direction impossible to determine. Mitchell followed it anyway, trusting instinct over instruments that gave contradictory readings. She walked for what her watch claimed was 30 minutes, but felt like hours, passing through sections where previous explorers had left markers, some recent, some corroded by what looked like decades of exposure despite the cavity's sealed nature. Then she found chambers that shouldn't exist. Rooms containing camping equipment from different eras, a 1950s military surplus tent, 1980s backpacking gear, modern ultralight equipment, all arranged as if the occupants had just stepped away. Food supplies partially consumed, water bottles at various levels of depletion, personal items scattered naturally. These are all the missing hikers, Mitchell realized. Their campsites, preserved in temporal stasis, waiting for them to return from wherever the cavity displaced them to. Jessica's voice grew clearer. "I can see light. There's an opening. But every time I try to reach it, the passage changes direction." Mitchell discovered her in a room where time appeared to move at varying speeds in various places. Spatial distortion rendered distance meaningless, as Jessica Morgan, who appeared to be precisely 23 years old, ran toward an opening that kept vanishing as she got closer. "Jessica!" "Stop moving!" With a mixture of relief and bewilderment on her face, the young woman froze and turned to face Mitchell. "Ranger? Thank God. Since Tuesday, I've been stuck here. Everything has been wrong ever since I fell into this cave system after becoming separated from the trail." "What year is it, Jessica?" 1987. May 1987. I was on a graduation trip here. At ASU, I'm finishing up. Why do you ask me that?" Mitchell's heart fell. "Because 2023 has arrived. For 36 years, you have been absent." Jessica stared at her, processing information that couldn't be true. "That's insane! I've been here for 5 days. 5 days! Look at my supplies. 5 days' worth of consumption." She was right. Her backpack showed 5 days of use. Food wrappers, water consumption, wear patterns all, consistent with less than a week of camping. But the equipment itself was vintage 1987, the brands and styles matching the era. Time flows differently here. Outside, decades passed. Inside this chamber, only days. You experienced 5 days while the world experienced 36 years. My parents, they must think I'm dead. I'm sorry, Jessica. But we can get you out now. We know how to navigate the cavity. Leading Jessica back toward the entrance proved more complex than Mitchell anticipated. The young woman's presence affected the cavity's geometry, as if the space was resistant to releasing her after holding her for so long. Passages that had been clear suddenly filled with obstacles. Walls shifted to block routes. Gravity fluctuated, making walking difficult. "It doesn't want to let me go," Jessica said with growing panic. "This place is alive, and it's keeping me here." Mitchell radioed topside, but static overwhelmed transmission. The cavity was actively interfering, creating electromagnetic distortions that severed outside contact. They were alone in geometry that played by its own rules. For what might have been hours or minutes, Mitchell's watch had stopped working. They navigated by instinct and desperation. Mitchell left rope markers, but they vanished when she looked back. She spray-painted arrows on walls, but the paint disappeared or rearranged into different patterns. Then they reached a chamber that contained something impossible. Mitchell herself. Another Sarah Mitchell, wearing the same uniform, carrying the same gear, sitting against a wall with a journal. But this other Mitchell looked older, exhausted, defeated. "Don't trust the exits," the other Mitchell said without looking up. "I've been trying to leave for 3 years. Every path leads back here. The cavity doesn't release people. It collects them." "Who are you?" Mitchell asked, though she feared the answer. "I'm you. Or I was you. 3 years ago, by my count, I entered this cavity to rescue Jessica Morgan. I found her, just like you did. Tried to lead her out. But we never made it. We've been trapped here ever since, experiencing years while minutes pass outside, aging while the world stays frozen." Jessica backed away. No, this is wrong. We're leaving. Now." But as they ran, they encountered more versions of themselves, multiple Sarah Mitchells and multiple Jessica Morgans, all trapped at different points in their failed escape attempts. Some had been there for subjective weeks, others for years, all aging in a time-dilated pocket while trying to find an exit that kept receding. "It's a trap," one older version of Mitchell explained. "The cavity creates copies. Or maybe we're all the same person, experiencing this rescue attempt from multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. Either way, there's no way out. The geometry is a closed loop. Every exit leads back to this chamber. The original Mitchell, or the version of herself who believed she was original, refused to accept it. The Parker group escaped. Emily and her family got out. There has to be a way. The Parker group was on the edge, barely inside the distortion field. You're at the center now, in the deepest temporal pocket. Different rules apply here. This is where hikers don't just get delayed or experience time dilation. This is where they disappear forever. Mitchell sat down, examining the situation logically. If they were truly trapped in a temporal loop, their voices should still be transmitting outside. The acoustic lensing would carry their distress calls through the rock, and Tom Reeves would be organizing rescue. Unless no time had passed outside. Unless they'd entered a pocket where subjective years occurred in objective microseconds, making rescue impossible because there was no time frame in which to mount one. "We need to disrupt the loop," Mitchell said. "The cavity responds to our presence, reconfigures based on our movements. What if we stop trying to leave? What if we go deeper instead?" The other versions of herself shook their heads, warned against it, explained they'd tried every strategy. But Mitchell saw something they hadn't. All the failed attempts involved trying to escape. None had tried fully surrendering to the cavity's geometry, following its flow instead of fighting it. She took Jessica's hand. "Trust me, we're going to walk deeper into the impossible. And that's how we'll find the exit." They moved through passages that bent in directions that had no names, chambers where up and down were negotiable concepts, tunnels that existed in more than 3 dimensions. And the further they went from conventional geometry, the more the cavity's structure stabilized. Because they weren't trying to leave. They were accepting the space as it existed, following its own internal logic, rather than imposing external expectations. After walking through topology that would break minds less prepared for impossibility, they found it. The true exit. Not a passage back to the drill hole entrance, but a different opening entirely, one that led to a part of Grand Canyon that no map showed because it existed in dimensionally shifted space. They emerged on a cliff face that shouldn't be there, in a section of canyon that was simultaneously part of the normal landscape and outside it. Mitchell radioed Tom Reeves, hearing his immediate response. "Sarah? Where have you been? You've been out of contact for 10 minutes. 10 minutes! They'd experienced subjective hours, maybe longer, but only 10 minutes had passed outside. Jessica Morgan stood in 2023 sunlight, looking at a world that had moved on without her for 36 years. Her parents were elderly now, her friends middle-aged. Her graduation ceremony long past. She was still 23, but everyone she knew had aged decades while she remained trapped in temporal stasis. Agent Webb handled the complex reintegration process, how to document someone who'd been legally dead for 36 years suddenly returning unchanged, how to explain to family that their lost daughter was alive but displaced by nearly 4 decades of life experience she'd missed. "There are others still in there," Mitchell told Webb. "Multiple versions of people, or the same people experiencing the loop from different temporal perspectives. We need to mount rescue operations." "We can't. The cavity's geometry is unstable. Every entry risks creating more temporal loops, more trapped versions. The only reason you escaped is because you stopped trying to escape conventionally." Mitchell returned to normal duties, but the voices continued. Every night she heard transmissions from the cavity. Dozens of hikers calling for help across different time periods, their consciousness trapped in dimensional pockets where rescue was impossible because time and space no longer corresponded to any framework that made rescue feasible. The rescue that never happened. because for every successful extraction, dozens more remained trapped in temporal loops that replayed their disappearance eternally, or in pockets where years passed as microseconds, aging the trapped while the world outside moved too slowly to mount rescue before their subjective decades of isolation drove them mad or killed them through simple starvation that, from outside perspective, happened instantaneously. Ranger Mike Chen was 3 months into his first season at Grand Canyon when he took a solo patrol of the less-traveled Hermit Trail on an August morning that would become his last day in normal time. He radioed base camp at 7:43 a.m., reporting clear conditions and routine inspection. He never made his 9 a.m. check-in. By 11 a.m., Sarah Mitchell organized search and rescue. Mike Chen was young but well-trained, carrying all emergency equipment, unlikely to have gotten into trouble on a trail he'd hiked dozens of times during training. They found his equipment at mile marker 2.8, backpack, radio, water bottles, all neatly arranged on a flat rock as if deliberately placed. But no sign of Chen himself. No tracks leading away. No blood. No evidence of struggle or accident, just his gear. Abandoned for reasons unknown. "This doesn't match any scenario I know," Tom Reeves said, examining the scene. "If he fell, his gear would go with him. If he was injured, he'd use the radio first. This looks like he carefully set everything down and walked away naked into the canyon." They searched for 3 days, using helicopters, tracking dogs, thermal imaging. Nothing. Mike Chen had vanished completely from a trail section with limited places to disappear to. The terrain was steep but navigable, with sight lines that made hiding nearly impossible. On day 4, Mitchell found something impossible. Fresh footprints leading back to the spot where Chen's gear sat. The prints were his. She'd memorized his boot pattern, but they appeared overnight, as if he'd walked back to this location from somewhere and then vanished again. "Someone's playing games," Reeves suggested. "Another hiker taking his boots, leaving false trails." But the prints were perfectly spaced, matched Chen's gait, showed his weight distribution. They were authentic. Somehow Mike Chen had returned to this spot, left fresh tracks, and disappeared again without recovering his equipment. The investigation continued for 2 weeks before being downgraded to a cold case. Missing ranger, no explanation. Another statistic in Grand Canyon's long history of unexplained disappearances. Then on September 23rd, 46 days after his disappearance, Mike Chen walked into Bright Angel Ranger Station at 6:17 a.m., looking confused and exhausted, but physically healthy. "Mike!" Mitchell grabbed him in relief and confusion. "Where have you been?" "We've been searching for you for 6 weeks." Chen stared at her with profound disorientation. 6 weeks? "Sarah, I've been gone for 3 hours. I left on patrol this morning, got turned around in a weird fog, and hiked back. It's still August 17th, right?" "It's September 23rd. You disappeared August 8th. "That's impossible. My watch shows 10:47 a.m. I started patrol at 7:43. 3 hours have passed. How can it be September?" But physical evidence confirmed the impossible timeline. Chen's facial hair growth matched 3 hours, not 46 days. His body showed no dehydration or starvation despite missing for weeks. His uniform wasn't weathered by extended exposure. Everything about him indicated a 3-hour absence, not 6 weeks. Dr. Holland arrived within hours, bringing Dr. Eleanor Price, a temporal physics specialist from MIT. They examined Chen thoroughly, finding disturbing contradictions. "His telomeres show 3 hours of cellular aging," Dr. Price explained. "His digestive system contains his breakfast from this morning, August 8th morning, not September 23rd morning. His circadian rhythm hasn't adjusted for missing 46 days. Biologically, he's experienced 3 hours. Chronologically, he's been missing 6 weeks. "Where was I?" Chen asked desperately. "I remember hiking into fog, feeling disoriented, and then emerging near the station." "What happened to those 46 days?" "You weren't in them," Price said. "You skipped forward through time. You entered a temporal displacement field, experienced 3 hours subjectively, and emerged 6 weeks objective time later. It's like you teleported forward through time while your personal timeline advanced normally." Mitchell thought about the implications. If he was in a temporal field for 3 hours while 6 weeks passed outside, that's a dilation ratio of about 1 to 336. He experienced time running over 300 times faster than normal. Correct. Which means from his perspective, the world outside was frozen. If he'd been able to see beyond the fog, everything would have appeared stationary, moving too slowly to perceive. They tried to help Chen readjust, but he struggled with missing 6 weeks of life. Events had occurred, staffing changes, news stories, his family thinking he was dead, a memorial service held, all while he experienced 3 hours of confused hiking. But something else emerged. Chen began displaying knowledge he shouldn't have. "There's going to be a rock slide on South Kaibab tomorrow at 2:14 p.m., he mentioned casually one day. "Near the Ua Point." "How would you know that?" "I don't know. I just know. Like memory, but not memory." The next day, at exactly 2:14 p.m., a significant rock slide occurred at the precise location Chen had specified. Park services had evacuated the area based on his warning, preventing potential casualties. Over the following weeks, Chen accurately predicted 7 more events: weather changes, equipment failures, a hiker's medical emergency, all with precise timing and detail that suggested something beyond lucky guessing. Dr. Price theorized the explanation. Temporal displacement can create causal anomalies. If Chen jumped forward 6 weeks in compressed subjective time, he might have created a closed time-like curve, a loop in space-time where information from the future can influence the past. He's not predicting events. He's remembering them from a future he already experienced in some quantum sense. That sounds impossible. Everything about his disappearance is impossible by conventional physics. Once you accept temporal displacement, you have to accept its consequences: causality violations, information flowing backward, the future affecting the past. But there were darker implications. Chen began experiencing memories that weren't his. Other rangers, other disappearances, other timelines. He'd suddenly know facts about cases he'd never studied, remember conversations he'd never had, recall versions of events that didn't match official records. "I remember finding you in the cavity," he told Mitchell one day. "Multiple versions of you, trapped in temporal loops. But that hasn't happened yet. Or it has happened, and I'm remembering a timeline that got erased. I don't know anymore." Agent Webb classified Chen as a temporal anomaly himself, a person whose consciousness had been scattered across multiple timeline threads, experiencing echoes from past and future versions of reality that existed in quantum superposition until observed and collapsed. "He's unstable," Webb explained. "The displacement event didn't just move him through time. It entangled him with multiple potential timelines. He's seeing past events that might have happened, future events that might happen, and present events from other timeline branches." Is it dangerous? Unknown. He might stabilize as his consciousness re-anchors to this timeline, or he might continue fragmenting, experiencing more timeline echoes until he can't distinguish which memories are real and which are quantum possibilities. Chen tried to continue working, but the timeline confusion made it impossible. He'd start conversations referencing events that hadn't occurred, follow protocols that didn't exist yet, use equipment that hadn't been issued. His mind existed partially in multiple temporal states simultaneously. "I see other versions of myself," he confided to Mitchell during a particularly difficult episode. "The version who never came back. The version who died in the fog. The version who emerged 50 years in the future. They're all me, all existing simultaneously in superposition, and sometimes I can't tell which one is actually real." They transferred him to a facility that specialized in temporal displacement victims, the few dozen people worldwide who'd experienced similar phenomena and developed the same timeline-hopping consciousness. Most couldn't function in normal society, their minds too fragmented across multiple temporal states. But before Chen left, he gave Mitchell a warning. "You're going to encounter something called the convergence point. I've seen timelines where it kills you, timelines where you shut it down, timelines where it destroys the entire park. I don't know which timeline we're in, but it's coming. September or October, location varies. Watch for places where time feels heavy, where your thoughts seem to echo before you think them." That's the convergence manifesting. Mitchell researched convergence points, finding classified documents about temporal anomalies where multiple timeline branches intersected physically. These zones were extraordinarily dangerous. Reality became uncertain. Multiple versions of events could occur simultaneously. Causality broke down completely. "We've identified 3 convergence points forming in Grand Canyon," Webb confirmed when she asked directly. "They're not natural. Something is destabilizing the local space-time, creating conditions where different timelines can merge or diverge. Chen's displacement probably happened because he stumbled into a pre-convergence field. What happens if they fully converge? Best case, nothing. The timelines merge without incident. Worst case, catastrophic reality breakdown. Multiple versions of Grand Canyon overlapping in the same space, with contradictory physical laws trying to operate simultaneously. The park could become uninhabitable, or cease to exist in any consistent form." Mitchell spent the following months monitoring for convergence. Signs, locations where hikers reported strange experiences, where time felt stretched or compressed, where memories didn't quite match events, where equipment malfunctioned in impossible ways. She found 7 potential convergence zones, all in remote areas, all showing the same warning signs Chen had described. Time felt heavy in those places. Thoughts seemed to echo. Reality felt optional. And in one location, a box canyon near Horseshoe Bend, she found something that proved Chen's warnings were accurate. 3 versions of the same boulder, occupying the same space, but from different timelines. The rock was simultaneously intact, cracked, and completely eroded, all 3 states existing together in quantum superposition until she observed it, at which point it randomly collapsed into one state. "The convergence is accelerating," Dr. Price confirmed after examining the boulder. "We're seeing timeline interference at macro scale now. Soon, entire sections of Grand Canyon might exist in multiple contradictory states simultaneously." They evacuated high-risk areas, closed trails near convergence zones, tried to prevent civilians from stumbling into regions where reality wasn't reliably singular. But they couldn't close the entire park, couldn't explain the real reason for restrictions without causing panic. The ranger who came back wrong, because Mike Chen hadn't just jumped through time, he'd become temporally unstable. His consciousness entangled with multiple timeline versions of himself, seeing past and future and alternate present all simultaneously. driven slowly mad by experiencing reality as a quantum superposition rather than a singular deterministic flow. A warning of what Grand Canyon's temporal instability could do to anyone unlucky enough to encounter the convergence points where different versions of reality tried to occupy the same space and time, making consistency impossible and causality optional, where the park itself existed in multiple contradictory states, waiting to collapse into single timeline, but unable to decide which one was real. October 14th arrived with atmospheric conditions that meteorologists couldn't explain, air pressure fluctuating wildly, magnetic field readings spiking and dropping randomly, reports from across Grand Canyon of wrong feelings, temporal distortions, reality seeming fragile. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of what had become known as Convergence Point Alpha, the box canyon near Horseshoe Bend, where three versions of the same boulder existed simultaneously. Except now, it wasn't just the boulder. Entire sections of canyon wall flickered between different states, intact, eroded, covered in petroglyphs that appeared and disappeared, aging centuries in seconds. Tom Reeves radioed urgently. "Sarah, you need to evacuate." The measurements are not accurate. Whatever Chen forewarned about is now taking place. I understand. I sense it. Here, time is running out. Several timelines attempting to coexist in the same area, using experimental technology that could theoretically reinforce a single timeline and prevent convergence. Dr. Price arrived by helicopter equipped with emergency temporal stabilization equipment. However, her face conveyed skepticism about its success. "The convergence is more severe than models predicted," she explained while setting up field generators. "We're not seeing simple timeline overlap. We're seeing full reality divergence. Multiple contradictory versions of Grand Canyon attempting to occupy identical coordinates simultaneously." Mitchell looked across the canyon, seeing impossible overlaps. In one spot, the Colorado River ran at 3 different water levels simultaneously. High flow from recent rain, low flow from drought, and completely dry riverbed, all coexisting in visual superposition until she focused on one, at which point the others faded temporarily before reasserting. How do we stop it? We can't stop convergence. We can only try to force reality collapse into a single consistent timeline. But that requires choosing which timeline becomes real and which ones get erased. And we don't know what the consequences of erasure are for people existing in those alternate timelines. Agent Webb arrived with federal authorization to attempt forced timeline collapse. We evacuated a 12-mile radius. Everyone who was in the convergence zones has been relocated. If we're going to do this, now's the time. They activated the temporal stabilization field, and reality screamed. The convergence didn't collapse, it accelerated. All 3 convergence points, alpha, beta, gamma, synchronized, their temporal distortions linking and amplifying. What had been localized anomalies became canyon-wide reality breakdown. Mitchell watched in horror as Grand Canyon began existing in multiple time periods simultaneously. She saw the canyon as it appeared in 2023, overlapped with versions from 1950, 1847, 10,000 BCE when it was being carved by the river, and futures she couldn't identify, some showing the canyon flooded, others showing it filled with structures, others showing it eroded beyond recognition. "The field isn't stabilizing," Price shouted over equipment alarms. "It's amplifying! We're making it worse!" They shut down the generators, but damage was done. The convergence had achieved critical mass. Timeline barriers had dissolved across 17 square miles of Grand Canyon, creating a zone where past, present, and future existed simultaneously without chronological order. Mitchell suddenly saw other versions of herself. Not reflections, not hallucinations, actual Sarah Mitchells from different timelines, all standing in the same location but experiencing different realities. One Mitchell wore a uniform style from the 1980s. Another looked elderly, scarred, surviving a timeline where something catastrophic had happened. A third was younger, still in training. And dozens more, all variations of her across different timeline branches, all suddenly visible and aware of each other. "This is wrong," the elderly Mitchell said, her voice overlapping with all the others. "We're not supposed to perceive each other." Timeline branches should remain isolated. "The convergence is breaking isolation," another Mitchell explained. "We're all the same person, but from different quantum decision branches. Every choice we made differently created a new timeline, and now they're all collapsing into the same space." Mitchell, the one who considered herself original, tried to communicate with her alternates, finding it disorienting as memories that weren't hers flooded in. She remembered events she'd never experienced, relationships she'd never had, career choices she'd never made, all bleeding through from alternate versions of her life. "We need to separate," the elderly Mitchell insisted. "Prolonged contact between timeline versions causes consciousness merging. We'll lose individual identity and become a quantum superposition person, existing in all states simultaneously, but unable to function in any single timeline." But separation was impossible. The convergence held them together, forcing interaction between alternate selves who shouldn't be able to perceive each other. And it wasn't just Mitchell. Across the convergence zone, every person who'd ever been in Grand Canyon existed in duplicate or triplicate or more, all versions from different timelines suddenly visible and interacting. Tom Reeves appeared in 5 versions, each having made different career choices, aged differently, carrying equipment from different eras. Dr. Price existed in 3 states, one as the physicist she'd become, one as a medical doctor from a timeline where she'd chosen differently, one as someone who'd never entered science at all. "Reality is trying to reconcile contradictions and failing," the physicist version of Price explained. "When multiple timelines occupy the same space, the universe attempts to collapse them into single consistent history. But with this many contradictions, different people, different choices, different physical laws from alternate timeline branches, collapse is impossible. So everything exists in superposition indefinitely." Mitchell watched as Grand Canyon itself fractured into temporal shards. She could see areas that were simultaneously day and night, summer and winter, populated with visitors and completely empty. The geometry was wrong. Trails existed and didn't exist. Buildings stood and were ruins. The river flowed and was dry. All states overlapping without resolution. Then she saw Mike Chen. Or rather, she saw dozens of Mike Chens, all the versions he'd described experiencing. The Chen who'd disappeared and never returned. The Chen who'd died in the temporal fog. The Chen who'd emerged 50 years in the future. All of them real. All of them present. All experiencing their own timeline versions while simultaneously overlapping with the others. "Sarah!" all the Chens called simultaneously, their voices creating chaotic echo. "I warned you about this. The convergence makes reality optional. You have to force a collapse before everyone loses coherent identity." "How?" "Choose," the elderly Mitchell interrupted. "Someone has to make a definitive observation that forces quantum collapse. Pick one timeline as real, and all observers commit to that choice simultaneously. It's the only way to restore consistency. But how do you choose which reality becomes real when you're seeing dozens?" Which version of events gets to exist while others are erased? Which people survive the collapse, and which vanish because their timeline branch gets pruned from existence? Mitchell made a decision that would haunt whatever version of herself survived. She designated her own timeline, the one where she'd rescued the Parker Group, where Mike Chen had returned displaced, where the convergence had happened in October 2023, as the primary timeline. Then she used emergency protocols to broadcast that designation to all observers in the convergence zone. Everyone, all versions, focus on my timeline, accept this version as real. Collapse alternate branches. The quantum waveform resisted. Too many contradictions. Too many alternate versions with equal claim to reality. The convergence zone trembled as physics attempted to force incompatible timelines into single history. Reality screamed again, louder this time, and then made a choice. The convergence collapsed violently, timelines merging and annihilating, alternate versions vanishing as quantum superposition resolved into single, definite state. Mitchell watched her alternate selves disappear one by one. The elderly version, the younger version, the versions who'd made different choices, all erased as her timeline asserted dominance. But not everyone from alternate timelines vanished. Some people remained, displaced from their original branches, now existing as refugees from erased realities. They remembered lives that hadn't happened in this timeline, relationships with people who didn't exist here, events that contradicted official history. Mike Chen survived, but he was composite now. Consciousness merged from multiple timeline versions, remembering different outcomes for the same events, carrying knowledge from futures that wouldn't happen, and pasts that had been overwritten. "How many people did we erase?" Mitchell asked Dr. Price after the convergence stabilized. Unknown. In alternate timeline branches, there were people who existed but don't in this timeline. Conversely, some people here didn't exist in other branches. Net change might be 0, or we might have erased thousands, or created thousands. There's no way to count people who never existed from our perspective. Agent Webb classified the event at highest secrecy level. Official story is seismic activity caused temporary evacuations, no mention of temporal convergence, timeline collapse, reality breakdown. The displaced people will be integrated quietly with manufactured backgrounds. But the convergence had left scars. Sections of Grand Canyon still showed temporal instability. Areas where time flowed at inconsistent rates, where past and future occasionally bled through, where hikers reported seeing things that shouldn't exist, or didn't exist yet, or had existed once in timelines that got erased. Mitchell found she had memories that weren't entirely hers. Fragments from alternate timeline versions that had merged with her consciousness during the collapse. She remembered dying in 2019 from a fall that hadn't happened. She remembered meeting Tom Reeves for the first time in 3 different years, with 3 different circumstances. She remembered alternate versions of her entire life that contradicted the one she'd actually lived. "You're quantum scarred," Dr. Price explained. "Consciousness fragments from erased timeline versions persisted and merged with yours. You're mostly you, but with echoes of who you were in other branches. It's permanent. The memories will always be there, contradicting your lived experience." Mitchell struggled with identity questions she'd never expected to face. If she carried memories from alternate selves, was she still entirely herself? Or was she a composite consciousness, merged from multiple quantum states, existing as a superposition person who'd been forced into single identity? The Grand Canyon returned to normal operations, but it was forever changed. Rangers trained to recognize temporal anomalies. Warning signs marked convergence zones. Hikers signed waivers acknowledging unusual geological phenomena without explaining the phenomena were temporal, not geological. And sometimes, late at night, Mitchell would stand at the canyon rim and see flickering in the distance. Brief moments where alternate timelines reasserted, showing her different versions of the landscape, different possibilities. Reminders that reality here was thinner than elsewhere, that the convergence had weakened barriers between quantum states permanently. The convergence, where multiple realities collided, where Grand Canyon existed in contradictory states simultaneously, where people met alternate versions of themselves and learned that every choice spawned new timelines that usually remained invisible but had collapsed here into chaotic overlap. Forcing observers to choose which reality survived, while others were erased along with everyone who existed only in those pruned branches, leaving survivors with quantum scars and fragmented memories from lives they'd lived in timelines that no longer existed, except as ghost echoes in consciousness that couldn't be separated from primary identity anymore. Sarah Mitchell stood at Mather Point on a November evening, 6 weeks after the convergence collapse, looking across Grand Canyon at a landscape that held too many secrets. Behind her, Tom Reeves compiled the classified report that would never be publicly released, documentation of phenomena that officially didn't exist. 3 major incident categories, Reeves summarized. Temporal traps where hikers experience time dilation. Displacement events where people jump forward or backward through time. And convergence zones where multiple timelines physically overlap. And counting? Mitchell asked. In the past year alone, we've documented 47 temporal incidents, 17 missing persons that are likely trapped in time-dilated pockets, 8 displacement victims like Mike Chen, who returned months or years displaced from their disappearance, and 3 convergence events that required reality collapse to resolve. Agent Webb joined them, carrying updated federal assessments. Grand Canyon is now classified as a permanent temporal anomaly zone. The geology here, the specific combination of mineral deposits, magnetic field variations, and dimensional stress from the canyon's depth, creates conditions where space-time is fundamentally unstable. Why here specifically? Mitchell asked. Why does Grand Canyon have more temporal phenomena than other locations? The canyon's depth creates gravitational time dilation at measurable levels, Dr. Price explained, appearing with her equipment. Bottom of canyon experiences time slightly differently than the rim, normally an insignificant variance, but combined with unusual electromagnetic properties and quantum effects from specific rock formations, that tiny dilation amplifies into regions where time can stretch, compress, or loop entirely. They reviewed maps showing documented anomaly zones, 17 locations where temporal distortion was confirmed, 43 more where incidents suggested instability. Nearly 30% of Grand Canyon's area showed some level of temporal unreliability. We can't close a third of the park, Webb stated. Economic impact would be catastrophic. Instead, we monitor, we warn quietly through ranger briefings, and we respond to incidents without explaining their true nature. Mitchell thought about all the people still trapped. Jessica Morgan, rescued from a 36-year displacement but struggling to exist in a world that had moved on. The dozens of voices still transmitting from the acoustic cavity. Hikers from different eras trapped in dimensional pockets where time flowed at impossible rates. Mike Chen and other displacement victims, their consciousness fractured across multiple timeline experiences, unable to fully stabilize in single reality. What about future convergences? She asked. If it happened once, it can happen again. It will happen again, Price confirmed grimly. Temporal instability is increasing. Climate change? Seismic activity? Something about the modern era is making the conditions worse. We're projecting another major convergence within 5 years, possibly multiple smaller ones before that. And we still can't prevent them. No, we can only manage the aftermath. Force collapse into single timeline, integrate displaced people, suppress information, and hope that next time we don't erase too many alternate realities in the process. They stood in silence, watching sunset paint the canyon walls in colors that might or might not be the same colors from minute to minute. In areas of temporal flux, even light wavelengths could shift between observations, making the landscape subtly different each time you looked. How many people have we lost? Mitchell finally asked the question that haunted her. Not just the official missing persons. How many people existed in timeline branches that we erased during the convergence collapse? Thousands, Webb admitted. Maybe tens of thousands across all the alternate branches. They lived entire lives in timelines that got pruned. From our perspective, they never existed. But they were real in their timelines. They had thoughts, experiences, relationships. And we erased all of it by choosing this timeline as primary. Could we have chosen differently? Yes. Any timeline branch could have become primary. We'd be standing here having this conversation, but our memories would be different. Our past would be different. Some people present here would be gone, and others would exist that currently don't. There was no right choice, just a choice that had to be made. Mitchell felt the weight of that decision. She'd designated her timeline as real, forcing quantum collapse that made her version of history definitive. But in doing so, she'd erased countless other versions. Other Sarah Mitchells who'd lived different lives, made different choices, had different outcomes. Were those alternates truly gone? Or did they persist somewhere as ghost echoes in quantum foam? The canyon remembers, Dr. Price said quietly. That's what makes Grand Canyon unique. Most locations don't retain temporal information. Quantum decoherence erases alternate timeline data naturally, but here, the geological conditions preserve it. Every event that ever happened in any timeline branch remains encoded in the rock's quantum state. The canyon literally remembers everything, every hiker who got trapped, every displacement, every convergence, even the timelines we erased. It's all still here, recorded in dimensional structure that exists beyond normal space-time. So the disappeared aren't really gone. Correct. They're quantum archived, under specific conditions, convergence events, high temporal stress. Those archived states can reassert. The missing hikers can reappear, displaced people can return, erased timelines can briefly resurface. Grand Canyon is a living record of everything that ever happened here across all quantum branches, and sometimes that record plays back. They watched night fall, seeing stars appear in a sky that looked normal, but wasn't. Sensitive equipment detected occasional flickers where the stars rearranged briefly, showing constellations from different eras or alternate presents before snapping back to current configuration. Will we ever understand it fully? Mitchell asked. Unlikely, Price replied. We're three-dimensional beings trying to comprehend four-dimensional temporal phenomena while experiencing five-dimensional quantum effects. Our brains aren't equipped to fully process what's happening here. We can document, respond, manage incidents, but true understanding requires perception beyond human capability. The classified report would join hundreds of others in federal archives, evidence of temporal anomalies that public would never see, incidents that officially never happened, missing persons attributed to conventional causes, while the true explanation involved time dilation, displacement, convergence, and quantum effects that violated common-sense reality. Grand Canyon would remain open. Tourists would hike its trails. Most would experience nothing unusual. But some, the unlucky or unaware, would stumble into temporal pockets where time broke, where they'd experience hours while days passed or days while hours passed, where they'd see alternate timelines bleeding through, where they'd encounter versions of themselves from quantum branches that shouldn't be accessible. And the rangers would respond, document, classify, and maintain the silence. Because admitting the truth, that Grand Canyon was a massive temporal anomaly where reality itself was optional, where past and future could intersect with present, where multiple timelines existed in superposition waiting for observation to collapse them into single state, would shatter public understanding of how the universe operated. Mitchell accepted her role as guardian of impossible secrets. She'd rescue who she could, document what couldn't be rescued, and remember the people who existed in timelines that got erased. Ghost echoes that only she remembered because her consciousness had merged with alternate versions during the convergence, giving her memories from lives she'd never lived in this branch of reality. The canyon that remembers everything, because Grand Canyon's unique geology made it a living quantum archive, recording every event across all timeline branches, preserving even erased realities as dimensional echoes that could resurface when temporal stress was high, making it simultaneously one place and infinite places, one timeline and all timelines, real and unreal, where hikers disappeared into temporal traps that aged them decades while hours passed outside, where rangers returned displaced by weeks or months or years, where convergences forced observers to choose which reality was real while erasing countless alternates, where voices from all eras called for rescue from dimensional pockets that existed outside normal space, where the rocks themselves remembered everything that ever happened in any quantum state, and sometimes played those memories back for rangers who stood watch over phenomena that officially didn't exist, but privately defined their entire careers protecting visitors from temporal anomalies that could trap them in time loops, lasting subjective centuries, while objective minutes ticked past, making Grand Canyon not just a natural wonder, but a quantum phenomenon, where reality's normal rules became optional and the disappeared were never truly gone, but archived in dimensional structure, waiting for the right conditions to return from timelines that had been erased, but persisted as ghost probabilities encoded in rock that remembered everything across all possible pasts and futures simultaneously.